If you drive down any back road in Guilford County long enough, you'll pass an old cemetery, some behind a church, some hidden in the pines where the stones lean and the names are fading. If you stop and walk through, you'll notice something right away. How many of the graves belong to children? Tiny markers, barely knee-high, born and buried in the same breath of history. During the Great Depression, death came quiet and often. Babies didn't always survive their first winter. Children died from fevers, infections, and things as simple as hunger or scurvy, from diets too poor to keep them alive. Families buried their young with hearts shattered, but their hands were tied. These weren't careless parents. They were doing everything they knew with nothing in their pockets. It was the kind of grief that people had learned to live with. They didn't move on. They just kept moving. But every now and then, something happened that nobody could make peace with. It's one thing for a child to die of sickness or starvation, but it's another thing for a child to be murdered. And in 1930s Guilford County, that unthinkable grief came knocking. I'm Darlene.
And I'm Melody.
This is Hard Times and True Crimes. So, guys, we're working with a new piece of equipment that we're very excited about.
And it's supposed to help our audio quality, but we are on a learning curve. Be gracious, hang in there with us as we learn how to use it.
So, Melody, tell me about your week.
Tim and I went to Durham yesterday for a fun day, and we did some hiking at the Eno River State Park.
That's
but
fun.
The coolest thing we did, it would have been the coolest thing if it had worked out, but there is a secret tunnel that goes under the roads there in Durham.
That is so cool. So, like what?
There used to be these tunnels underground that people that worked at that tobacco company could go back and forth under the highway and stuff.
That is cool.
And now someone has gone in there and made like a little murder mystery type game in there.
Oh my gosh.
And they put it's called the Trippy Tunnel and the Zodiac Drain. But we couldn't find it.
Oh my gosh.
We walked all day and we looked and looked. And after I got home, I asked ChatGPT, why could I not find the Zodiac Drain? And it said it's been closed since 2020 for construction. Tim kept telling me, I think it's there and I think it was blocked off. And I'm like, no, that's not it. But he was right.
Oh man, that would have been awesome.
It would have been. And I wanted to take you there so bad because I love a good creepy tunnel.
Of course. Yeah. Me and Lindsay found one when we went to West Virginia. They're fun. I've just been working. I love my job. I have a great job. Learning some new things. And so, yeah, I've been on a learning curve at work too, but it's great. And I feel like I'm getting more and more accomplished.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. This story is out of Guilford County.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and it took place in the 1930s, right smack dab in the middle of the Depression.
Okay.
On the morning of Wednesday, September 30th in 1931, Sumner Township. Do you know where that's at?
No.
So it's in Guilford County, about 6 miles from Greensboro.
I think I have heard of a Sumner school.
Okay.
So maybe.
A woman named Mrs. Leonard, she was up before daylight with the chickens. She had to catch a ride with neighbors at 6 o'clock sharp to head to her shift at the Bluebell Overall Company. That would be the same factory that would eventually become known across America as Wrangler.
Yes.
One of the most iconic denim brands in history was born from that company.
I remember when Bluebell still had factories in Greensboro.
Really?
Yes.
So they've been around apparently since the early 1900s. They changed names a couple of times, but it was really cool because it was shaped by the hands of women like Mrs. Leonard. Before she left for work, she had to do her chores at the house as well because she was married and she had children. And at that time, most factories actually refused to hire married women. In fact, when I was researching for this episode, I came across an article, a help wanted ad for a factory, and it said, married women need not apply.
Okay, I'm going to try not to be offended at that.
I know, right?
In those days, women couldn't go to the bank and get a loan either. Or I guess they couldn't even have their own bank account. They had to be on their husband's bank account.
Yeah. So single women could work, but married women, no, their place was at home. So Mrs. Leonard was one of the lucky ones, and she had a good husband, but she still had her housework to do. Both of their jobs were extremely difficult. Thomas, though he was a farmer with a long list of his own chores to do every day, and he also worked for neighboring farms, he was the one who would get the children up in the mornings, and he would keep the kids with him until they went off to school, until they were school age. And so their oldest daughter, Vera, named after her mama, was 9 years old and in school. And their youngest, little Fred, he was 5, and he stayed home with his dad for now until he went to school the next year. That Wednesday morning started off just like any other. Thomas and Vera got up first to have their cup of coffee and spend a minute together before she had to hurry off to work. Mr. Leonard got up and got the kids ready. He fed them the little hoe cakes their mama had made them the night before. And for those of y'all who don't know what a hoe cake is, it was a simple food, like a commodity during the Depression. And even after, they didn't require refrigeration. And so the kids could pack them for their lunches and husbands could take them to work. Have you ever had a hoe cake?
I don't think I have.
So my grandma used to make them. Now here in North Carolina, I think they make them with cornmeal. She made them with flour. She made them in a cast iron skillet. And basically it was like a pancake biscuit.
I was envisioning like a pancake. I think I have had one before.
Okay.
And like a potato pancake.
Yes.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, that's exactly.
Made out of corn flour or hominy, I'm thinking?
Yes. Here in North Carolina, they were made out of, the cornmeal or hominy. I don't know why, but I grew up eating those. So I was like, oh, hoe cakes. Thomas had work that morning over on a neighboring farm. And so he had to leave at around 7. He and little Fred headed out together. But before he left, he told Vera, finish getting ready for school, do your chores. And he told her to go on out and catch the school bus that would come between 8 and 8:15. And this was not unusual. Vera was a responsible girl, 9 years old. She's used to that routine. Most mornings, especially when both of her parents had to be out early, she'd walk and wait out for her bus. To us, that sounds like horrible. How could you leave your 9-year-old at home to catch the bus? But back then, nobody batted an eye at that. Especially in Sumner. It was a very small town. Neighbors looked out for each other, and it was just a safe little community.
Right.
Around 8:15 that morning, the school bus rolled past the Leonard place like it always did. The driver slowed up to a stop where Vera usually stood by the road with her little satchel in her hand, but this time she wasn't there. He gave a quick honk just in case she was running late or maybe out back still feeding the chickens. But there was no sign of her. That wasn't entirely unusual, though, because sometimes she and other children waiting to catch the bus, their neighbors would be heading to town and they'd get in the back of the truck and we'll give you a ride, that kind of thing. So the driver figured she'd probably gotten a lift from one of her neighbors. So he eased the bus back into gear and didn't really think anything else about it. But about 45 minutes later, just shy of 9 o'clock, a truckload of passengers headed to Greensboro noticed smoke rising above the trees near the Leonard farm. So they pulled over and rushed toward the property, thinking maybe it was a brush fire or hoping somebody was burning off crop stubble, something like that. But when they got closer, they saw that it wasn't the field, that it was the Leonard's home that was on fire. As soon as he saw the flames, the man didn't hesitate. He rushed toward the house and immediately just started pulling out what he could, chairs, quilts, tables. Back then, people didn't have insurance policies and safety nets, especially during the Great Depression. If your house burned down, you didn't just drive to town and buy more stuff.
Exactly.
Like we do today. You had to start over from nothing. And people at that time, they hardly had anything to begin with. And a lot of times furniture was passed down. It might have been built by a grandfather. The quilts were patched by hand. Even a single plate had a story.
And some of that stuff was really already heirloom.
Right.
Guess. Yeah.
Exactly. And even though Vera, she had that job, any little hiccup could have sent them into ruin. They weren't starving or anything, but I guess they lived close to that line. Every dime she brought home went straight into the cost of living, enough to keep a roof over their heads and a little something on the table for supper.
Yeah, probably like most people during that time.
Exactly. One of the men, C.C. Pope, noticed that nobody was at home, and so somehow he ended up going to the outhouse, and when he did, he noticed that there was a pool of blood in the outhouse.
Oh, no.
He knew the Leonards and knew that Vera had likely been at home alone that morning. He called the schoolhouse just to make sure that she had made it. And that phone call came to the front office asking if little Vera had made it to school. Stuart Deskins was this principal, and he answered that call. He didn't have Vera's attendance slip in front of him, so he ran down the hallway asking her teacher, Mrs. Trudy Coltrane, if Vera had been in that morning, and she said no, she hadn't. So Stuart jumped in his car and drove straight to the Leonard place. And as he got closer, the road's filling with smoke. And by the time he arrived, he saw neighbors out there with buckets of water.
And that was the principal that ran to the house, or that went to the house?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. And then he saw Thomas Leonard. He comes tearing down the road, riding in the truck of the man that he had been working for that morning. Somehow he had got word. They said he didn't stop to ask any questions. He just jumped out and ran toward what was left of his home and started joining the men, fighting the flames and putting out the fire. And it hit him like, where was Vera?
Oh.
So he looked around and did she make it to school? You can just imagine his thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And so he hollered out, has anybody seen my girl?
Oh.
And that's when Mr. Deskins, Vera's principal, looked back at him and started walking toward him. And Thomas knew that something was wrong.
Sure, his heart just sunk.
Oh, I'm sure. Then he was told about the blood in the outhouse. So Thomas, he ran straight into what was left of the house. The walls were scorched, but they were still standing. Some of them were. The roof was sagging. Neighbors followed him in. Everybody's searching frantically for Vera. The sheriff had arrived by then with a couple of his men, and they started combing the area around the house, some looking in the house. Back through the woods, about 100 yards from the back of the house, one of them found a little girl's coat, and it was soaked with blood. And there was more blood smeared across the grass and the leaves. The sheriff brought the coat back and handed it to Thomas, and it was Vera's.
Oh, so sad.
With even more urgency now, they're searching. And guys, I want to give a warning here because I'm about to give a description, and it can be hard to listen to, especially if you're sensitive, through the debris, pushing aside boards, that broken furniture, until someone looked under what was left of a bed frame. And there was 9-year-old Vera Leonard. She'd been wrapped in one of her mother's quilts. Her skull had been crushed. Her little arms were almost burnt completely off. Her body was burnt so bad, it was a horror that no father should ever have to see.
No.
As more and more people made their way out to the Leonard place, neighbors, kinfolk, strangers from down the road, they started to notice that there was an older black man who kept showing up, walking near the tree line. He had come up and then he had left and then he had come back again. And a few had seen him step closer to the crowd. And it just stood out to everybody. Again, this is the 1930s Jim Crow era. So I think black people did stand out.
And I would think any onlooker who kind of is watching from a distance would look a little suspicious.
Because he's not asking questions like everybody else is.
Yeah, he's kind of standing off to the side and then...
So 58-year-old Will Moore, he was a laborer doing field work. That same day, he, along with 2 other black men, were arrested, 25-year-old Lacey Crutchfield and 18-year-old William Hedden. The Salisbury Post, using the language common at the time, described them as Negroes. I'm going to say that sometimes throughout this episode, and I've chosen to include it just to preserve the historical accuracy of the story.
We are in the 1930s.
Right.
Now.
They brought the 3 men in for fingerprinting because somebody had left fingerprints on a bucket that was close to where Vera's little coat was found. And so the sheriff wanted to see if any of these men, if their prints matched what they had at the scene. My first thought was, why them? Was it racism, or was it something that made them focus on them?
Okay. Were they singled out, or
Right.
was there a reason for them to be more suspicious of them?
So the truth is, they were working nearby that morning. They were doing some farm work. And in 1931, North Carolina, being black and near a crime scene, it was enough to get you looked at, probably. Because I do think there were some other people that they could have looked at.
But they didn't.
While Will Moore was being questioned downtown, officers went out to his home to search. He lived about a half of a mile from the Leonard home, right next to the Goshen School. Goshen. And I am so sorry, I don't know if it's Goshen or Goshen, but it was a red bricked Rosenwald school that had just finished being built between 1930 and 1931. And at the time, it served the local black children and was one of the many schools across the South that were funded by the Rosenwald Initiative. And it would later become the New Goshen United Methodist Church that was built in 1970. And so the cemetery beside it holds generations of black families from Greensboro, including Thomas E. Alston, who had played for the Greensboro Red Wings and then played on a Negro League baseball team from the 1930s, St. Louis Cardinals.
Oh,
yeah.
How about that?
So he made it into the big time. Yeah,
Nice.
He made history. So I thought that was pretty cool. Now there's actually a historic marker there. It's on Randleman Road.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Moore lived about a half a mile from the Leonard home, right next to the Goshen School. So
Okay.
on Randleman Road. So his wife wasn't home at the time, and they went in, searched. And while searching the house, they moved an old broken down organ behind a door, it said. I don't know how that works.
And he was the guy, one of the laborers.
He was the old guy that was
the one
kind
that
of
was
coming
kind
in, like looking on, coming back and forth. Yeah, his wife wasn't home. They went in, searched. They found an old broken down organ, and behind it, they found a burlap sack, and inside it were a pair of white overalls stained with blood.
Mm.
Investigators also had recovered a pair of shoes with U.S. stamped on the soles, and that would end up sealing his fate because those same letters were pressed into the dirt where Vera Leonard's coat and where all that blood had been found out back. Some of Will Moore's acquaintances, men who had worked for Leonard's neighbor, Walter Short, they told police that he had tried to sell them the overalls the morning before the murder, and at that time they were clean, so there was no blood on them. They also learned that Moore was supposed to have picked peas that morning in the adjacent field to the Leonard's place. He had gotten 2 burlap sacks to be able to pick those peas in a bucket of water from the home of Max Short. And remember that bucket that they had found? So, yeah. And so Max Short, who lived near the scene of the crime and who was the person he would have picked from. That water bucket was found by the officers in the field about 25 yards from the fence hedge where Vera's blood-soaked coat had been found. But I don't know how close that field was.
Okay.
That's hard. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know. By now, William
Hedden
and Lacey Crutchfield had been released, and the focus was solely on Will Moore. Sheriff Statford and Police Chief M.D. Cathy went into his cell and questioned him for some time. It was clear that he was starting to crack, and after putting him in a padded cell alone, Moore told the sheriff, "I might have something to say in a few minutes." So they gave him some space, and when the officers returned, Will Moore finally broke his silence and said, "First of all, my name isn't Will Moore, it's Asbury Respus." Asbury, R-E-S-P-U-S. And they say that it may have been pronounced back then Respus.
Okay.
Because they say that there were other people back then, and that's how or other people with that same last name that lived in that area, and they pronounced their name Respus.
Okay.
He had escaped from the Raleigh State Prison where he'd been serving time for the 1912 murder of E.B. Wine, a man from Northampton County. After arriving at the prison, he became criminally insane and was sent to a mental hospital, actually Dorothea Dix. But his stay was brief, and he was transferred back to the prison and put to work as a cook in the kitchen. In 1916, Respus said he and 3 other inmates crafted a makeshift key, and they used it to escape the kitchen and then scaled a prison wall and disappeared.
Wow.
But he didn't leave the state. Instead, he headed to Guilford County and settled in over there by Greensboro. For 15 years, he lived under the radar, a free man hiding in plain sight until Vera Leonard's murder brought his past crashing down on him. Around that time, a mob of more than 1,000 men had gathered outside the Guilford County Jail and courthouse demanding Asbury be turned over to them. Sheriff Stafford and the Guilford County deputies had to act really fast. The mob was getting more aggressive by the minute, so they quietly moved Asbury out of the county and transported him to Raleigh for safekeeping. But the crowd was not satisfied with that. In fact, they were so determined to get to him that the sheriff was forced to let a group of them walk through the jail to see for themselves that he was gone. And even after that, they wanted proof, so they had to show them documentation confirming that he had been transferred out of Guilford County.
Wow, they were out for blood.
They were. He would have been killed for sure. Sheriff Stafford later made a public statement. He said that during that automobile ride from Greensboro to Raleigh, the man who had called himself Will Moore, and now we know his real name is Asbury Respus, gave a full confession to the murder of Vera Leonard. It could have been the relief of being spared from that lynch mob. Maybe it built up some rapport with him and them because they helped him get out of there. But he told the sheriff that he had been drinking heavily that morning and was still high on cocaine. In his words, that devil, mean liquor, just got in me. In 1931, both alcohol and cocaine were illegal under North Carolina state and federal law because we were under prohibition, and that was still in effect. And cocaine actually had been legal for many years, but by 1931, it was not. But it wasn't impossible to find like today, especially in labor camps and just in poorer, I think, neighborhoods. People were still using and addicted to it. Asbury said he saw Vera standing at the end of her driveway, waiting for the school bus. He grabbed her and dragged her to a woodpile behind the house. They really tried to get him to admit to raping her. He said no. He said that he did not rape her. He finally said that it had been his intent, but that she screamed and it scared him.
Okay.
And so that's when he panicked and hit her in the head with a stick of wood and knocked her unconscious. He claimed that he didn't know if she was dead, but rather than get help, he dragged her into a little patch of woods behind the house. He told the sheriff he got scared and didn't want to leave her body in the woods, so he carried her back into the Leonard home, wrapped her in a blanket, placed her under a bed, and then set that house on fire. Then he went home and changed his clothes. And after that, came back, and that's when they saw him coming in and out of that crowd. On that ride, Asbury also told the sheriff he was originally from Jackson, North Carolina, born sometime in the late 1870s to Miles and Ellen Respus. We don't know much about his childhood. They didn't leave journals and a trail of family memories back then. Especially being Black, the census records weren't as easy to follow. But he did claim that sometime as a small boy, he fell from a barn loft and hit his head. He still had a dent in his skull that was visible years later. So it's going to be really debated whether or not that played part in all of that. In 1900, he would marry a woman named Ophelia Harrell, but Ophelia lived in Northampton where he had murdered that man. And so I imagine that when he went to prison, that was the end of that. He couldn't go back to her. She was still living in the small town of Severn in 1940. Her name showed up in the census years after, up until the 40s. He remarried, and so I'm guessing it was illegally.
Because he never divorced.
He never
the first
divorced.
wife. He just didn't come back home.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah.
Meanwhile, hundreds of people gathered from Sumter and all sections of Guilford and surrounding counties at Rehoboth Church, which was almost within a stone's throw of the burned up Leonard's home, to pay a final tribute to little Vera Leonard. Her little body had been carried to the country church and placed beside the altar, where a little simple but very sad service was conducted. The pastor was Reverend G.W. Williams, and the little girl had been a regular at the Sunday school there. Her house was like right there. So she would just walk over to Sunday school. Her whole family went there.
Yeah.
Her little Sunday school classmates from the Sumter School and church served as her flower bearers at the funeral.
Oh,
I know, that's so heartbreaking.
it really is.
On October 28th, just a month from when the murder was committed, the trial of Asbury Respus began. Hundreds of people, both black and white, crowded in and around the courthouse, wanting to catch a glimpse of this child murderer. And if they were extra lucky, they were hoping to get a seat inside the courtroom. The National Guard had been called for safety concerns. But according to the newspaper, the crowd that day was mostly made up of curious onlookers rather than agitators. The saddest part was Vera's parents sitting in the courtroom as the trial unfolded, tears streaming down their faces as the horror of their daughter's final moments were laid out for the jury to hear.
Yeah, those poor parents.
I can't imagine.
I can't either.
But when the prosecution brought out Vera's bloody coat, the one she'd worn that morning, that's when her mother just broke into open sobs.
Yeah, she probably lost it.
She did.
Oh, goodness.
And just the guilt you feel, because even though none of it was their fault, I'm sure the dad's like, why did I leave her? I can just imagine, did I tell her I love her that morning?
Yeah. And then you always play the what if game. What if we had just been a few minutes later? What if this? And
yes.
How could you not have those thoughts?
Of course. Though he'd been charged with assault and arson as well, the prosecution really focused only on the murder of Vera. The defense attempted to argue that Respus suffered from mental illness, hoping that an insanity defense might save him from the electric chair. Respus had claimed that his violent urges came on suddenly, that he would have fits, these episodes where he felt overcome by a need to kill and run wild like a dog. But people who had worked alongside him testified that they'd never seen him have any such fits. And a mental health professional who had interviewed him several times said that there were no signs of mental instability. The defense presented only two witnesses. One was C.C. Honeycutt, the warden of the state prison, and Dr. J.H. Norman, a physician at the prison. It was said that Asbury entered the state prison on August 13th in 1921. Remember when he was there for that first murder? On February 25th, he was admitted to the insane ward and stayed there until May 26th. He stayed in the prison until September 13th, 1916, when he escaped and went to Guilford County and picked up the name Wilmore. On cross-examination, the warden had seen nothing really amiss in his actions, except that one occasion when he was sent over, and that was because he was having hallucinations where he was seeing a trunk. And because of that, he was sent to the insane ward. Afterwards, he showed no indications of being anything other than perfectly sane. Dr. Norman testified that he treated Asbury for an epileptic fit after he was taken to the Raleigh State Prison. following his arrest for the murder of Vera. He was laying on the floor, unconscious and foaming at the mouth. On cross-examination, he said that it was possible the prisoner could have faked his condition, but he did not think so. 4 people testified to having known him for 10 to 12 years, having employed him at various times. They had noted nothing wrong when said that they believed that he was sane. The warden, he testified he was testifying on his behalf. The doctor that was there at the prison was testifying on his behalf. Other people that were testifying against him, it was nobody that was close to. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I am surprised that the warden would testify on his behalf because he's guilty of killing that little girl. I don't think it matters if you're in prison and you show signs of. I
think that the defense probably, can't you make them?
Yeah, they could subpoena him. So
Yeah.
Maybe not willingly, but the defense might have called him. Gotcha.
Exactly.
I gotcha.
I believe too that he was slow, and I'll tell you why I believe that in just a second. I'm not saying that it's an excuse that he didn't murder her, but I am saying you are supposed to look at these things in a trial.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Dr. Wesley Taylor, he was an expert, and he said that he believed that Asbury was completely sane. The entire trial, from start to finish, took under 3 hours.
What?
The jury deliberated for only an hour.
Wait, but 3 hours?
3 hours.
That didn't sound like he had a very, I don't know.
No.
That's a little weird.
That's what I'm saying. There's no way that was a fair trial, 3 hours. The judge asked Asbury to stand after the guilty verdict had been decided, Asbury constantly muttering, "Please, Judge." Judge Shaw asked him if there was any reason that the death penalty should not be imposed. Asbury said I was in a spell. And then he said again, "Please don't kill me."
Okay. But he never said he didn't. He never went back and said he didn't.
No.
He admitted to it. He just admitted that he was under a spell.
Yep. The judge said the announcement of a death sentence was the hardest task assigned to a jurist. He told the prisoner he was just the mouthpiece of the law and that it was the law imposing the death penalty and not the court. He said there was always hope to be held out to any prisoner until his final day, but he warned that he should not depend too much upon it, the hope of a reprieve, but that he should prepare to meet his God. Then he formally handed down the sentence. The judge ordered that the prisoner be taken to Raleigh and delivered to the warden of the state penitentiary and there be safely kept until January 8th, 1932, on which date between the hours of 4 a.m. and 3 p.m., a current of electricity shall be caused to pass through your body of sufficient intensity to cause death, and said current shall be continuous until you are dead, dead, dead. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul.
Gosh, that's some strong word. Imagine that would put fear in you, hearing those words spoken over you. That would put some fear in you.
He started to cry.
Oh, I bet.
And after a few seconds, looked like he was going to have some kind of a spell, according to the newspaper. The National Guard then cleared the way for the sheriff to take him out of the courtroom. The court didn't break out into any applause or any demonstration at all because Judge Shaw had warned that it would not be tolerated. The newspaper said that the decorum of the court was unparalleled. The judge also made sure to give the sheriff and deputies time to take Asbury and put him in an awaiting car to be taken out to Raleigh before the crowd was released from the courtroom. Soldiers watched the crowd outside in other parts of the building. Before the court adjourned, Judge Shaw, he took the time to express his thanks to all the jury. And he said that he was sorry that they had to do a night session, but he felt like it was necessary. They were assured by him that they had well served their state and performed their duty. Now, did he get a fair trial? By modern standards, absolutely not.
Yeah.
This trial lasted less than 3 hours. The state talked for an hour for its presentation of direct testimony and half an hour for redirect testimony. The defense had 2 witnesses. and took about a half an hour. And then the conference of counsel took up the rest of the time.
Wow.
That was it.
I do think that's the shortest trial I've ever heard of.
Yes. But I do think that the scales were not balanced, especially for Black people. Not just Black people, but I think probably child murderers.
Sure.
Because the trial was a lot different. But I think about the murder of Mary Fagan over in Georgia, and we know that they wanted him.
Yeah.
They wanted him dead.
He didn't get a fair trial.
No.
But he did confess. And so at that point, I would imagine the people just want to see justice take place.
Right.
Because like you said, it's a child murderer and nobody wants to have a lot of mercy. Them.
Oh, yeah.
So if he's guilty, I still think he needs a fair trial. But if he's guilty, I don't feel a bit sorry for him getting the death penalty.
Yeah. No, I don't either.
But I do think he's guilty.
Okay.
Unless you're going to tell me some more information.
And two, I think trials move quickly because public pressure ran really high. You had to be careful what you said in a trial because you had to go back to your hometown. So I don't think any of his friends would have probably testified on his behalf. His wife stayed very far from him. There would not have even probably been a white man there who would have had the courage to stand for him because...
So maybe even his own defense attorney didn't really care to do that great of a job.
Exactly. I think they knew what was going to happen before they ever went in there. Yeah, access to fair defense was probably limited for him. We know juries were always all white males back then. In the case of Asbury Respus, the system, though, they did follow the procedure of the day. They had a trial, witnesses, a verdict, and they did provide safety for him. I will say that they wanted it to be a lawful.
Yeah, they didn't just turn a blind eye so that the lynch mob could have their way.
Exactly. But we got to acknowledge that due process back then, it just wasn't what it is today. And was he not slow or had some kind of a mental deficiency? They went out of their way to say in court that he did not. But in a newspaper article, the very same day that Vera's body was found in the Greensboro, I think it was the Greensboro Gazette, the Salisbury Gazette said that he was described by officers as mentally deranged.
Huh.
And so I do believe there was something to that claim.
Okay.
That he was mentally off.
Okay.
But I think mentally off and mentally incompetent are two separate things. So if you're hiding things, then you know the difference between right and wrong.
And and his mental capacity, he's been smart enough for 15 years to evade us. He had escaped and evade being picked up again. He had to have had some kind of mental faculties there.
Exactly. While the community waited for Asbury Respus's execution, they also pulled together for the Leonard family, whose grief was unimaginable. Not only was their only daughter, Vera, murdered in the most brutal way, they lost every single thing that they owned except for the clothes on their back.
Oh, yeah, because their house burned up.
Their house burned, yeah. They're left with nothing. S.C. Deskins, remember the Vera's principal at Sumner School? Yeah. He started the Leonard Family Relief Committee. Classmates of Vera, they gave what little they could, nickels and pennies. Neighbors donated services, food, and household goods. Even strangers who didn't know the Leonards at all gave money.
Oh.
A big tent was put up near the scene of the crime, and people came from miles around, mostly out of morbid curiosity. But they didn't just come to gawk, they also gave money.
And I do think communities do tend to pull together when there's a tragedy like that.
They do. And that's really a beautiful thing that happens. And it added up. Employees of the Bluebell Overall Company, where Miss Leonard worked, took up a separate collection and raised $385. That was a lot of money during the Depression.
Oh, yeah.
The total relief fund reached $580, which was actually, again, substantial for that time. Lumber and mill workers from several Greensboro companies joined forces, and on the morning of October 12th, less than 2 weeks after Vera's murder, a crew of volunteers showed up and started working. Together, they built the Leonard family a brand new modern little bungalow on the Sumner Pleasant Garden Highway, just a mile south of where the murder had taken place. The home had 5 rooms and an indoor bathroom. Soft rugs were laid on the floor. The walls were beautifully furnished, furniture, kitchenware, bed and table linens. Every detail was just thoughtfully thought of and provided by friends, co-workers, neighbors, and local businesses. Paint, windows, electrical fixtures, and even the lumber itself was donated. And so the heartbreak of losing their daughter couldn't be helped. There was nothing that was going to fix that for them. But there's no doubt that the compassion shown by their community helped ease some of the burden that they were carrying. Now, we know that 1931 was knee-deep in prohibition, America's great moral experiment to outlaw alcohol. And just like today, people would use any possible issue to make their point.
Sure.
If a crime was committed and liquor was involved, the temperance crowd would say, see, this is why liquor should be banned. And if someone was drinking bootleg whiskey in secret, getting hurt or hurting someone else, the other side would say, this is what happens when you push things underground.
Yep.
So political leverage was alive and well, as it is today.
As it is today.
In the days that followed Vera Leonard's murder, the people of Guilford County grieved and they took sides.
Oh.
On Sunday, October 11th, 1931, the Greensboro News and Record published an article by a private citizen named W.L. Spoon titled Mean Liquor. It painted Vera's death as the result of a nation's failure to crush the sin of alcohol. The newspaper read, "Shall innocent 9-year-old Vera Leonard die in vain? Will none of the 2,000 enraged men who stormed the city in search of the fiend who slew and burned her body turn to the trail of the serpent that really killed her?" And that serpent, according to the editor, was alcohol, what the writer would repeatedly call mean liquor. He was making a play on the words of Respus's own confession when he told law enforcement, "It was mean liquor that made me kill her." The paper called that the most terrible truth of all. Does he not thereby, with a demon's face and finger, point to indifferent men and women who wink at violations of the law with a terrible accusation? And it didn't stop there. The paper drew a straight line between Vera's death and every bootlegger, home brewer, and every citizen who drank or chose to stay silent on the matter. Where is Mr. and Mrs. Leonard's personal liberty? The writer asked. Can they go home and gather their 2 innocent children around their table? The anger wasn't just aimed at the killer, it was aimed at a culture that had allowed the seeds of evil to grow. My father left me a legacy. He told me, kill little snakes, they make big ones. Oh, that the 2,000 men with the same blood in their eyes as those who visited Greensboro September 30th would raid Sumner and Greensboro blockaders. It would be the driest spot this side the Sahara Desert. He even used scripture. He said, God spews out the lukewarm. It is wholly wet or wholly dry with him. Vera Leonard was not just a victim, but a martyr, and her blood demanded justice and a cultural reckoning.
Wow.
He ended his article again with, shall Vera Leonard die in vain? But not everybody agreed. In the same newspaper, the Greensboro Daily News, another article was written by a private citizen who used the name Citizen. And he came out swinging against the mean liquor editorial. This writer accused the other author of using Vera Leonard's death to score political and moral points. He wrote, some opportunists whoop it up for prohibition in your Sunday edition because a half-crazed man claims that mean liquor made him murder little Vera Leonard. He pointed out that some of the most calculated, cold-blooded criminals in history never had a drop of alcohol. Masterminds of gangs are clever, clear-thinking, temperate men and women. They have to be. And then he asked some philosophical questions. Was it mean liquor that caused Cain to slay Abel? Did mean liquor inspire the crucifixion of Christ? The stoning of Stephen? The persecution and murder of Christians by Paul? To him, the real problem was not the bottle, but the human heart in a broken world of greed, exploitation, injustice, and economic collapse.
And I would agree with that.
Yeah, me too. Is mean liquor responsible for the Great Depression, he asked? For the unjust distribution of wealth? For organized welfare's inability to meet human desperation? He said that if America didn't stop scapegoating liquor for everything wrong in the world, the consequences were going to be severe. Can't you hear it, he asked? The snarls of that mighty power, simple justice. It's coming, just as surely as death. To this writer, the real danger wasn't alcohol. It was moral panic and control, greed, and politicized religion that used suffering to strip away people's freedom. He saw prohibition as tyranny disguised as virtue. He closed his rebuttal with the words, "It is peace and prosperity for all, or hell on earth. Take your choice."
Wow. And he just signed it citizen?
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to know if he's like a pastor.
I don't know.
That's an interesting debate right there.
It is. It was actually like a lot of feminists who started the whole prohibition movement.
Have we had that discussion on here before?
Maybe we did, because Lizzie Borden was a big prohibitionist.
Yes. I think we did discuss it before.
We probably did.
Interesting.
In the final year of his life, Asbury Respus waited out his sentence in Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. His last days were quiet. The day before his execution, he made a simple request of the warden. He asked Mr. Honeycutt, would he stay with him until the end? The warden assured him that he certainly would, as much as he was able to. The same day, Respus was told he could have eggs for his last meal, but instead, he asked for sardines and crackers. The warden made sure he got sardines and all the trimmings.
That was his last meal?
I know.
Oh.
Asbury Respus made one more request before his execution. He asked if he could go to the warden's office. He wanted to tell his story. So this is the day before his execution. He wanted to sit down and tell his story.
Okay, I do want to hear what he says the day before his execution.
Yeah. So he sits down in the warden's office and explained again how when he was a kid, he fell off the barn and injured his head. He said that he had committed 7 killings when he was in a spell.
Oh.
Maybe 8. He said that when he was in his spell, he felt funny in the head and he just wanted to kill and run. Then he told how when he was in Northampton County before 1912, he had killed 2 black women, one named Lizzie Banks and another Zinnie Britt. He had shot Lizzie to death and beat Zinnie until she died because she had cheated on him. It was some kind of a domestic thing. He also killed a woman named Becky Storr in Boykins, Virginia, by beating her to death with a stick. Now, I will say that none of those murders were ever corroborated because they were black women. And like we were saying, just the records just weren't as
thorough.
Yeah, exactly. In 1912 is when he shot and killed E.B. Wine, which was a 57-year-old man. And he got in an argument with him and shot him. And that's when he finally got caught and was sent to prison. For a good while after he was out of prison, he stayed clean, but that didn't last. On the afternoon of January 14th, 1918, there was a mysterious death. J.W. Gilbreth had hitched his team up for a trip to town, and his wife, Mrs. Jean Gilbreth, told him that she was going to go to visit her friend and neighbor, and so they didn't start a fire that morning because they knew that they were both going to leave. Mr. Gilbreth, he left, went to town for several hours, and when he came back home, his house had been burned almost to the ground. After the embers died, they found Mrs. Gilbreth's body, and it was nearly cremated. There was no evidence of foul play because her bones were so crumbled by the heat that it literally just wiped away any trace of a crushed skull or anything else. But Mr. Gilbreth told them over and over that there had been no fire in the fireplace when he left. Asbury lived about a half a mile from there, and the night before he was executed confessed that he had beaten and killed her. And then there was a little Bobby Osborne who had left his house July 21st of 1920. He was 6 years old and was found 5 miles south of his home. He had been gone for about an hour when his body was found face down in a stream. Asbury was the one to find him and brought him home. He was questioned about this too. Now, at the time, they did not suspect foul play. There was nothing
They didn't know about those
on
other
his
murders.
body to indicate. He lived just a short distance from him as well.
Yeah.
And then he said when he saw him, he slapped the little boy, threw him into the water, and held his head underwater with both of his feet until he was dead.
Oh.
And then
I
know.
Horrible.
And then he picked him up and carried him to the nearest neighbor, saying he had found him this way. And then there was Eunice Stevenson, but everybody around there called her Aunt Bobby. She was an 82-year-old woman who lived by herself in a little house tucked away in a pine thicket not far from the old Concord school. She kept a few chickens and cleaned up a little bit. She did her own housework still. She kept herself up. Reminds me of my grandma. She was well known in the area. On the morning of July 18th, 1925, a 10-year-old boy named Willie Newman came by with a bucket of milk. He always brought her milk. That day, he found her body. She was hanging from a rafter in her kitchen. Her head was covered in blood. It was just horrific.
Gosh.
It looked like it had been staged to look like a suicide.
Okay.
But it wasn't. She had been beaten across the head with something like a fire poker or something heavier, likely while she was getting ready for bed, because one of her shoes had been taken off and the bed covers were turned down. Blood was smeared across the floor and her clothing was disheveled. A tow sack had been tied around her neck and fastened to the rafter, like I said, to make it look like she'd taken her own life. But nobody believed that.
Mm.
And it looked like she had been dragged across the floor.
Yeah.
Like she had been killed on one side, dragged.
Yeah, it was kind of obvious.
Yeah. And years later, in his final hours, Asbury Respus confessed to her murder. In the hours before his execution, he opened up and he said, "I've served my time on earth. I'd rather be dead and in heaven than down here being tormented to death." Then he said he believed he may have killed 9 people. Maybe more. He couldn't remember for sure. He said that there may have been a white woman in his old hometown in Northampton County, but the details were blurred. Too much time had passed, or maybe he had just lost the thread of his mind. That night, Asbury Respus was given his final meal of sardines and crackers, just like he'd asked. On the morning of January 8, 1932, he was led to the death chamber at Central Prison in Raleigh. As he entered the room and was strapped into the chair, he sang, "Lord, I'm leaving this world." Warden Honeycutt asked him, "Are you ready?" He replied, "Anytime, you always ready." At 10:26 a.m., the first jolt, 2,000 bolts, hit his body for 2.5 minutes. When it was over, he was still alive, and so they shocked him a second time, and then he died. Nobody came to claim his body, not even his widow, Estelle. He was buried without ceremony, and that was that. Asbury Respus was really North Carolina's first documented serial killer.
Wow.
But whether it's true or not depends on how much of what he said is true. Because here's the thing, he does not fit the mold of a serial killer. He had no clear pattern, no preferred victim type. He killed young, old, black and white, men and women. He used sticks, guns, even his bare hands. Some he bludgeoned, some he shot, one he may have drowned. He wasn't a rapist. He wasn't chasing power it didn't even rise to that level. According to him, he just wanted to kill. And that's where things get complicated because serial killers follow a pattern and Respus didn't. He gave most of his confessions all at once the night before he died to Warden Honeycutt. So that's interesting. It did seem like he really liked him and had built a rapport with him.
I believe he did it and probably did at least some of those that he confessed to, if not all.
Yeah.
And maybe he did have some kind of a head injury, but he needed to be put to death to protect other people.
Of course.
Yeah.
I'm not opposed to the death penalty. I do think everybody should have a fair trial because then we don't have questions like this later. Do you know what I'm saying? Unfortunately, when people do wrong, it brings up all these questions later. And so then you almost have to ask those questions. Was it on the up and up? Was it a legitimate confession? What?
I've been watching a lot of documentaries lately about that very thing, and it does make you think, oh.
Was he a poor, Black, possibly mentally disabled man living in a time when the justice system rushed to close cold cases? Or was he the devil in human form?
I think if he had not done it at some point, he would have redacted his confession.
Yeah.
I think he would have maybe later on had said, no, I didn't. I just think he would have, but he never did. Well, those were some hard times.
Yes, they were. That's it for today, y'all. I'm so glad y'all are here with us. Curtis will be back next week to give y'all the intro and the outro. If you've been with us for a while, thank y'all so much, truly. And if you're new, welcome. I hope y'all stick around. If you're enjoying the show, just take a few seconds to follow, leave us a quick review, and share it with a friend. That's the kind of stuff that really does help us climb the chart. And hey, don't forget to check out our t-shirts. We love them and we think y'all will too. It's a great way to support the podcast and look good doing it.